Okay, I was on mute. So thanks again, everyone, for joining us. Today is our last panel for the Graduate Careers Exploration Week. So we're excited that you're here and we're looking forward to a great conversation. So today our panel is on careers in science and technology policy. And we have three amazing alums joining us today who will share with us about their career paths and their experience in the area. So before we get started, I just wanted to talk a little bit about some housekeeping items. This event is for you all to learn, to ask questions, to get to know more about science and technology policy. So I'm going to let you all lead our conversations and ask any questions. So if you have any questions, feel free to use the reaction button at the very bottom of your screen and use the raise hand option to ask a question, or you can also unmute yourself and ask that way. And with that, I will turn it over to our alums to introduce themselves. So Dennis, would you like to get us started?
Sure, thanks, Jennifer. Yeah, my name is Dennis Butcher. I graduated from Illinois in 2012 from Andy Gorth's research group. And right now, excuse me, I work for the Air Force Research Laboratory at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, Ohio, with some science and technology policy stops along the way. I don't know how deep you want us to get into that right now, but yeah, I started, took a postdoc position at the lab for a couple of years out of school, working in the lab, doing organic photovoltaics and, science, flexible electronics type work. And then I took an opportunity to take a fellowship in Washington with AAAS for the S&T policy fellowships that they have. Which was a really great broadening experience to get into that world and understand, what's happening beyond the lab. As part of that, I actually ended up still within an organization of the Air Force Research Laboratory called the Office of Scientific Research, based in DC. Did some policy work as well as some building international relationships and tech scouting and things like that. So I wasn't maybe as policy heavy as some of the positions there, but definitely there was a flavor of that and exposure to it. And from there, I came back with that broader experience, and I'm now program manager in the Air Force, which there's technical elements to that, but it's also you're pulling in a lot of other skills and policy understanding and how to manage activity across an interdisciplinary team that policy and fellowship experience was very, very helpful for. And I'm still in that type of a role now as a program manager.
Awesome, thanks, Dennis. Stephanie, how about you?
Hi, everybody. My name is Stephanie McBride, and I'm currently a public health advisor at the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention in Atlanta. First, just a thanks to Jennifer for the invitation to be there today, and thanks to everybody for joining. I graduated from UIUC in 2010, completing my PhD in the Kelleher lab, which is unfortunately no longer there. I, like Dennis, also did a AAAS fellowship. I did that immediately after graduate school, and I spent 2 years working at the Department of Defense, supporting the Assistant Secretary of Defense for nuclear, chemical, and biological defense programs. I worked primarily during those 2 years on a cooperative program that worked to build public health capacity and strengthen global health security with partners in Africa and Asia. I'm happy to talk about that more later, if helpful. After my fellowship, I accepted a position in CDC's Center for Global Health. And I spent 6 years working there on global health projects, 4 years working in program management, coordination, collaboration, all with a policy focus. And then I spent 2 years serving as a special assistant to CDC's former director, Tom Frieden, covering CDC's global health and infectious disease portfolio. My current position, where I've been for the last 4 years, is in CDC's Division of Healthcare Quality Promotion. And our division manages all of CDC's programs related to healthcare and patient safety. So antimicrobial resistance, prevention of healthcare associated infections, and blood organ, other tissue, and immunization safety. And so I have worked on science policy issues in all of those jobs. A little bit further away from that now, working more on program management and coordination. I'm happy to talk about any of those positions if there's questions. Karen, over to you.
Thanks, Stephanie, and nice to see you. Also, thank you to Jennifer for the invitation, and again, really glad to be able to be here and spend time with all of you. My name is Karen Morrison. I graduated from Illinois in 2013 from the Hergenrother Lab. I considered a AAAS fellowship, but the timing didn't work out relative to my defense time. So I actually went to California to do a science policy fellowship with the California Council on Science and Technology. And so spent a year working in the California state legislature with their environmental quality committee, working on new laws and department oversight relative to how we manage the built world and impacts to the environment from that. So got to work on issues of fracking, transportation of hazardous materials by rail, pharmaceutical take-back programs. So a lot of elements of science policy in the legislative setting. I then moved from there to the California Department of Resources, Recycling and Recovery, which handles policy elements around recycling, trash, composting, kind of how we deal with waste that's developed, and worked as a policy advisor in the areas of packaging for about 3 years there. I then moved to my current Department of Pesticide Regulation in 2018 as a science and policy advisor for the directorate. And then promoted up to assistant director and chief science advisor. We're doing very similar kinds of work and also overseeing the scientific staff within the department. And I'm now acting chief deputy director at the department. And so continue to do quite a bit of science policy. We have about 2/3 of our department is scientists. And so a lot of the work that we do is very sort of heavily grounded in how we think about scientific analysis, and then trying to balance that with all of the policy, legal, political, practical considerations that come with any time science is intersecting with society and implementation. So happy to talk about any of those and questions you all may have.
Great, thank you all for those introductions. And now I'll turn it over to our participants to ask any questions. So if you have any questions, feel free to use the raise hand option or unmute yourself. So I'll get us started. So when you were a student in graduate school, what kind of drew you to science and technology or science policy, or this path that you may are on right now?
I could take a stab at that. It actually was not a path that I really had thought about while I was in grad school itself. A lot of the focus was, get to the point where you can get your degree and then figure out, if you're going to take a postdoc or find an industry position or something like that. And it wasn't until a few years later that I kind of found that path that it was more interesting for me to spread out, be more generalize my skills rather than stay in the lab. And so that's what ultimately appealed to me, to kind of set the conditions for scientists and engineers to go out and do the great work that they do. And that's kind of the same with where I'm at now with focusing on program management. You're really just trying to set conditions for everybody to do great work. And I found that most appealing to go after S&T policy after a few more years in the lab after school.
I can add a little bit to that as well. It's a little bit easier to answer that question more than a decade away. Hindsight is 2020. So, like Dennis, I was pursuing a just traditional, I guess, one of the traditional career paths and planning to enter industry positions. Was going through that application process and just I mean, I wasn't super excited about it at that time, like I thought I would be. And actually heard, I guess it was just at a presentation similar to this, one of the career day type things that are organized, they had a couple of science policy people that came and talked, and I was like, well, that's interesting. So I just sort of pursued them both. And as the process went on, the fellowship opportunities in science policy really seemed like a nice segue into maybe something a little less, that was something that wasn't an industry job for me. I was considering it as my postdoc. And so I was a temporary, those fellowships are, the one that I did was 2 years. It's a temporary position, a nice way to try something out. And ended up loving it and sticking with it. So I'm glad I made that choice. But looking back, like I think that there were some signs along the way that maybe a career that was more policy focused was going to be for me. I had a very positive experience in graduate school. Like I look back and I would smile most things about those years. I forget about all the bad stuff, I guess, over time. But I definitely enjoyed talking and writing about science a lot more than I actually enjoyed doing it day to day. I enjoyed a lot of the collaboration aspects of the research that I was doing. There wasn't any project that I did that was just by myself or even just within our research group at UIUC. So I really loved that relational aspect of that work. And then I think, like many who might be on the call, maybe over involved outside the lab, Graduate Student Association, Women Chemists Committee, all those things. And I really got a lot more out of those some weeks than I did of research. So I think there were some signs all the way through those 5 years that a career that was related to science, but maybe not in the lab, was the right for me. And then I've just happened to land in the government first, and it was a good fit and have stayed there ever since.
For me, so my focus has long been wanting to do something impacting society. That's always been a focus I had going into undergrad and then moving into grad school. But I thought I was going to do that through drug discovery, and found that I hated doing I didn't love the practical running columns, doing all that. Like, it was fine, but I didn't love it. And also that the timeline from when you start working on something for drug discovery to when it could potentially do anything meaningful was not a close enough nexus for me to really feel like I was excited to come in and do the work, and have sort of that buy-in to the work that I was doing. And for me, the aha moment for me was during my ORP defense. So I had proposed looking at excretion of pharmaceutical compounds and thinking about, like, what are environmental impacts from them. And one of my committee members, who I shall not name, looked at me after I was done presenting and said, "This is the weirdest idea I've ever heard. I don't understand why you would want to work on this." And I've since learned that there are plenty of labs who actually do this kind of research in the academic setting. But for me, it was that moment of, if this is what I'm really excited about and what I want to be working on, and I'm not seeing buy-in from academics who I respect to this day, that comment notwithstanding, that maybe this is not the right field for me. And I really need to be thinking about, where am I going to be able to have some of those more direct impacts for what that looks like. And I remember talking with Stephanie when she was back from, as part of her AAAS tour, and really looking at what are those different options. I will say, coming out of grad school, I had 3 tracks that I was looking at. One was science policy, one was going back to teach at a PUI, and one was looking at museum jobs. So really all of those different elements of thinking about science education, science communication, and interacting with either the public or those who are kind of working through training to go on and do the next thing, were all elements that I was considering in terms of next steps. So in terms of preparation in grad school, I think that there is, after my aha moment, I decided, and I do not recommend this, but that my last year of grad school, in addition to completing my dissertation, I did a graduate minor in museum studies. And so started taking classes again, my 5th year of grad school, which again, do not recommend. I'm very grateful that I did it. And it was really eye-opening for me to be suddenly back in classes, in the first place, but then also with French majors, with art majors, with folks who did not speak the same language that I did in terms of how we approach problems or how we were looking at things, but we're also really deeply interested in this issue or in this question of how do we talk about the world around us in some way? And that was really exciting for me to get into this area that wasn't just scientists, but also similar interests and similar goals for some of the things that we wanted to do.
Great, that's all really interesting. Thanks for sharing. What questions do we have from our students? Okay, so Rachel sent in a question in the chat. She's a second year in Chibi studying process optimization for environmental systems. Could you discuss about how working for a sometimes volatile government affects your work?
Boy. So in my current role as a program manager, the most immediate impact of a volatile government is the budget cycle. If you watch the news, we typically don't get a full year budget until, like last month. And so there ends up being a scramble that we deal with the fallout throughout, the ensuing couple of months to get the funding planned and figure out how we're going to contract it or do the work in-house. So that kind of affects everybody across government. What I'll also say is that, with changing administrations and even just within administrations, there's changing policy priorities. I'm in the Department of Defense, and a lot of my work is focused on manufacturing. So what we saw was a pretty dramatic increase in investment and senior leader attention because it's vital for economic interests as well as national defense, being able to make the things that we need to, provide solutions for warfighters and whatnot. But I know that was not the case at a lot of other agencies where changing priorities might mean your budget gets zeroed out or you're targeted for reassignment to other regions of the country or other things. So we didn't see that so much, but those, depending on where you're at and what your focus is, those were very real realities. So it's just kind of, it goes with the territory. And there's probably more volatility in the last few years than you might expect ordinarily, but it's hard to say.
And I'll just can't emphasize enough the budget aspects of what we do and what it means to not be able to plan. You can plan all you want, but until those dollars actually exist in your agency's account, you can't move them internally or externally. And there's a lot of rushing that happens a few weeks every year. But I want to talk about something that's a little different, and that's sort of working at an agency that's been so in the forefront of the news over the last couple of years with the COVID pandemic. I've worked now on 3 emergency responses at CDC, Ebola, Zika, and COVID. And this was very different. And I don't know if that's because it was just the direct impact on American citizens, just makes everyone more involved, engaged, and stressed or what, but it's very hard to both hear. It was the first time that I remembered hearing such disparaging comments about the place where I was working regularly in the news, on TV, on the radio, in the newspaper. That is not to say that what was being said was wrong or incorrect, but even if it's true, sometimes still hard to hear, especially when you have colleagues that haven't taken a day off in 2 years, and Saturdays and Sundays included, and to just know what that toll must be on them. So that's been really interesting over the last couple of years. And it's interesting to see how it has changed or not changed as we've had an administration change in the beginning of 2021. So that it's a very different environment than we experienced during Ebola and Zika. And I know that everyone has learned a lot and everyone is very tired, but also still, I guess, committed to doing what we need to do as the COVID pandemic continues. So that was it has been an interesting few years, and there's of course, the very technical programmatic impacts that it has on the work that you're doing, but you also think about morale and the health of your workforce and sort of what it means for the future of your organization. I think that it's just been an incredibly interesting couple of years at CDC.
So I'm at the state level, and so there's very different impacts for what that looks like. And I will say California maybe is not a great model state for how other state governments work. I find this question really interesting because I would say, generally speaking, government work is phenomenally stable compared to most other industries. And so I think there's a perception of a lot of volatility at the political appointment level, which is certainly true when you have administration changes, when you have something that goes terribly wrong and there's change up within leadership. But for sort of the bulk of who is doing the work within government, there tends to be a lot of consistency in who is doing that work, and that government is not designed to be nimble, for better or for worse, that there's a lot of sort of structures that are built in for process, for clarity, for opportunities for the public to be able to engage and provide feedback. And so that means that it takes time to be able to implement really large changes in sustainable ways, I think, to some extent in government compared to private industry, for example, where you can have a CEO come in and say, we're changing, and then it changes, the next day, the next week, the next month. So for me, I find that it feels pretty stable in terms of job security, in terms of, generally speaking, the direction that we're going. But we, again, in California, I think have had sort of more consistency in general approach for leadership, although certainly different administrations have different perspectives about what their priorities are and what they focus on. We also, to the budget point, we don't have the same kind of budget challenges that happen federally. This used to be a major problem in the state, and then we passed new laws to require that we have a budget in place by July 1, and if we don't, the legislators don't get paid. And so that is a phenomenal incentive for them to get their act together and to be able to provide a budget for the administration, which is helpful, and I think helps balance out some of the volatility that we would see 15 years ago in state budget, of kind of those lengthy negotiations for how do you actually support which programs. So I appreciate how stable, at least in my perspective, government work is compared to other kinds of jobs that I would work at.
Yeah, I would second what you're saying there. Yeah, at the working level, the civil servant level, there is stability there. People can't just be fired on a whim. What we do see increasingly with how the job market has changed quite a lot in 10 years, it looks very different than when I came out in 2012, is that for the very desirable competencies that people have, I think like digital, artificial intelligence, things like additive manufacturing, things that industry really wants, they are getting pretty good at plucking people out of government into industry. So that creates a little bit of churn, but that's on the spectrum of healthy, right? That means we're working the right areas, and we need to do better to be competitive, to bring those people into government, keep them there, give them interesting problems to solve. And I think that's happening, but it does impact some.
Some other questions?
Hi, I have a question. Hi, my name is Nita, and I'm a third-year chemistry student, and my work revolves around gold nanoparticles. So my question for you all is, as a graduate student, we gain many different skills, right? So would you say there are particular skill sets that we should focus on while in grad school if we're interested in a future career in science and technology policy? And if you worked on those skills during graduate school, what were some of the ways that you went about that?
I would say it's very easy to only work on the skills that you need in the lab to get papers done and to, get your thesis done. And I would say I was very much in that boat. So I would say working on anything that improves your ability to coordinate among groups, whether that's, volunteer activities or other kind of affinity groups or other extracurricular type things. Because ultimately, I've worked variously on things like gold nanoparticles and a lot of the specific science that I did in the lab. I don't interact with it anymore. It's all of these other things you learn along the way. You're getting a PhD, but it's really, problem solver degree is how I look at it. So anything that helps you with that, as well as this coordination and linking the science to the bigger picture issues, is if you want that path, work on those skills as well.
I'll add a couple of things to that list. I think one of the most valuable skills that you gain as a graduate student is your ability to take in a lot of data and information and synthesize it and then push back out to people who may not be as expert as you are in the topic that you're researching. So I think that if you can ever find opportunities to present your research, share it, talk about it with people who may not be working on the exact same thing you are, I think that's really helpful, whether it be at conferences or in more informal settings. So I think taking in lots of information, then especially putting it out in ways that are in plain language or in just very short form. And then just want to emphasize what Dennis said about coordination. And I think that just demonstrate, trying to build ways to, I know one thing is managing multiple different, I know that no one's working on a single project every day, but I don't do the same thing any day of the week ever anymore. So trying to just thinking about how you can build skills now to organize your time, manage your time, and manage multiple projects at the same time is really important. And then the final thing that I'll say is just the ability to make a good PowerPoint presentation and a clear spreadsheet. And maybe it's just because I work in the government that is an invaluable skill, to know those basic technological, how to present information clearly in many different formats, I think is something that I do all the time and didn't realize how valuable a skill that would be, even still now after 12 years in this job.
And I'll emphasize the point of communication and communication to a wide range of different audiences. As a part of my work, I'm interacting with technical experts who have their own doctorates in areas of subject matter relevance. And I'm working with, community members, migrant farm workers who are coming in who may or may not speak English, who have no idea what I do on a day-to-day basis. And so I'm talking about flexing those communication skills to be able to engage with people at the level that they're at and still be able to communicate what you're doing, to understand their concerns and to be able to take those to the next thing. I would also say that what you learn in the PhD is how to become an expert on a topic. And you spend 2, 5, 7 years either on a smaller project or over the course of your dissertation to become a subject matter expert. But I think that, to me, the key point is you weren't necessarily a subject matter expert when you came in. And that ability to not only take information and translate it and take it back out, it's also learning that new area and being able to have the confidence to come in and say that you may not be a subject matter expert now, but you will be in 6 months, right? Show me the papers, show me the past history on this. And for me, I've changed fields of areas a couple of different times now. And each time it's that ability to come in and say, okay, if you give me the information, I can take this in, I can educate myself, I can figure out who I need to talk to become an expert in this area and be able to contribute into the discussions that we're having.
Yeah, can I add one more point to that, and just to build off something that both Dennis and Karen mentioned? I think, Dennis, you mentioned that you don't think about gold nanoparticles much anymore. And I definitely don't think about protein mass spec data. Although we do have one partner we're funding now that is doing a little bit of work, and it's my favorite hour of every month that we get to talk about that. But I think that I get a question a lot. Well, if you're not, was it worth it to get your PhD if you're not working in that subject area anymore? And I have to say, absolutely yes. I would not have gotten the fellowship, first of all, without that degree. And I would not have gotten the jobs that I've had since without all the other skills I developed other than protein mass spec. And so I've gotten that question a lot. And I think that it is everything else that I learned has helped me be a successful candidate for all the jobs I've had since then, even if they have nothing to do with the topic that I did my dissertation on. I'm at my dad's visiting right now, and I was setting up for this, and I realized there's a copy of my dissertation behind me. I think it's the first time I've seen it in 10 years, so timely for today.
I think just the one last thing I'll add to that, and this comes up in meetings that I have, of sort of the stereotype of what someone who has a PhD brings to a conversation on science policy. And I think that there's a expectation that someone who has a PhD is going to come in and they're only going to talk very in the weeds about this particular scientific issue. And so I think a lot of what we've been talking about is those other soft skills, the ways of making connections and collaborations, communication, that those are, to me, the key elements that help translate the work that you're doing in the PhD to science policy and related fields.
Thank you so much.
So some of you mentioned about your AAAS fellowships. Could you talk a little bit more about that? What sort of led you to that and your experience with the fellowship?
Yeah, I can start on that one. Like I said, I learned about the fellowship while I was in graduate school. And for those that don't know, the American Association for the Advancement of Science is the organization that published Science Magazine. And for more than 50 years now, they've provided opportunities for those with advanced degrees to spend time supporting science and policy technology efforts in the United States. This started out as placements in congressional offices decades ago, and then has since grown to place those fellows in, I think, almost all departments and agencies across the government. Anyone that touches a science or technology concept has or has had, I think, a science and technology policy fellow in the past. And the process for that is you first apply for the fellowship itself. You have to have completed your PhD, and like Karen mentioned, the timeframes are now they're more terrible now than they used to be. When I applied, there was a lot more flexibility 12 years ago. But then you apply for the fellowship, and then if you are accepted as a fellow, you in non-COVID times would travel to DC for a week and have a series of interviews with offices that had potential placement opportunities for you. It's similar. The best comparison I found is to med school matching, where you describe your interest in science policy. The offices that have available fellowship placements then look at the list of applicants, and you're invited to interview in those offices that they think might be a good match. And then you're welcome to also reach out to offices that you're interested in to seek an interview opportunity with them. And I think I had 15 or 18 job interviews the week that I was in DC for the fellowships. And it sounds terrible, but it's really not, because you are sort of pre-screened. They know you're not an idiot. You have been selected for this fellowship. You meet all the necessary qualifications. So it's really just an opportunity to learn about what the potential placement opportunities do in their office day to day, and get to know the people and see what might be a good fit. I'll note that at the same time, I also applied for the American Chemical Society Science and Technology Policy Fellowships, who does, they place recent graduates in congressional offices. And so had an opportunity to do both. And so I know I had the mentality that I was just going to be as open as possible. I didn't if anybody wanted to talk to me, I would happy to go interview with them. I interviewed across the Department of Health and Human Services, State Department, the U.S. Agency for International Development, and then ended up my Friday afternoon at 5 o'clock in the Pentagon for the Department of Defense with the Office of the Assistant Secretary of Defense for Nuclear, Chemical, and Biological Defense Programs. I did not know anything about countering weapons of mass destruction at that point in my life, but I figured if I was going to make a big change away from being in the lab, why not go real big? And so I just took a leap of faith and ended up being a really great, it was sort of incredible, the willingness of that office to open up opportunities to the fellows that they had. I was the only one for the first year, and then additional came in after that. But the leadership in that office was really open to sort of giving you access and insight into processes that typically wouldn't be open to someone at an entry, basically what was essentially an entry-level job in the Department of Defense. So I'm just incredibly grateful for that. But I hope that that's a helpful introduction of how my fellowship experience was. And Dennis, turn it over to you.
Yeah, I mean, definitely the process was very similar to what I went through. You go through and you apply, it's a pretty standard, like grad school application. And then like there's an essay portion eventually to kind of screen down to finalists, and you go to DC and interview. And I actually, in a similar way, I interviewed in a lot of different offices, mostly at like the State Department and a few in the DoD, and ended up at AFOSR within the DoD. And it's such a broad swath of what you can do there. Each of these agencies are large in their own right and have a very diverse set of missions. And so it's really enlightening to see what is going on in the government, what some of our major focus areas are. And you go into these offices, and if you're selected and join there, they give you real opportunities. They'll give you portfolios or a set of tasks that you can actually run with and make a pretty big impact even in just a year or two while you're learning about all this other stuff along the way. And I kind of take a step back for how I ended up applying. I left grad school and went to be a contractor or a postdoc at the Air Force Research Laboratory, and kind of continuing on with lab work, and just finding that I wanted something kind of beyond that got closer to the problems rather than being at the bench, solving very small, particular, important scientific issue, but ultimately one that takes many years to see an impact. And so I was looking for more, and getting that breadth of skills and perspective. And kind of almost on a flyer, I learned about the program and applied. I actually started by trying to apply to the Department of Energy track, and with about 10 minutes left on the clock, I also submitted to the DoD and State Department track, and that's the one I got selected for to kind of go forward. So it's just kind of, it's really funny how these things work out sometimes. That the second choice of tracks within the fellowship is what I got. I really wanted to work at the State Department, and we didn't find a match, and I ended up back in the DoD. But that was the path that matched my skills and ultimately my interests. So I guess the moral of the tale there is don't be afraid to take those leaps, and even if you think it's not a perfect fit, give it a try. Go through the process, and you'll learn a lot just through the process as well, for what you want to do and where you might fit.
So I know the question was specific to AAAS. I'm going to broaden this slightly. So the CCST Science Policy Fellowship is actually modeled on AAAS's process for the state. So we're in our 12th or 13th year of doing this program in California, and are now modeling it into other states. So if there are a number of states that have permanent or semi-permanent legislatures that have similar programs to AAAS. It's much smaller on the state level. So we've expanded from 10 to 15 fellows for our state program versus 100 plus for AAAS on a given year. So there's sort of different levels of scale for options, but I think the process that both Dennis and Stephanie described is very, very similar for what the California Policy Fellowship looked like as well.
But of course, I'm going to add one more thing. Like I don't want to. I want to emphasize really sort of what an sounds so cheesy, an eye-opening experience the fellowship was. Like I had never like done any policy, what we would call science and technology policy work before that. Like I had no idea, and I also didn't really know what the breadth of work that was happening related to science and technology across all these government agencies. And a fellowship like this presents such a unique opportunity, not only through things like the interview process and through your job, like get experience knowing what these officers doing, but the network you build with other fellows, and I think this is probably true if you're doing it at the state or federal level, is maybe one of the most important things to come out of a fellowship opportunity like that. I mean, to this day, they're not only great friends, but fantastic colleagues and people that I see regularly at meetings. It's really nice to know that I probably know somebody that works at any government agency I need to contact. They probably don't not work in the exact office I need to reach, but having that personal connection and that network can't be undervalued and has been an incredible asset over the last 10 years.
Yeah, just building on that. I mean, that I found that to be true. The networking it's incredible that there's people all over the place that have had these types of fellowships and experiences. You know, I've had folks from the program that are hired onto contracts that I'm running by the companies that are executing that contract. And so there's always somebody with the skill set that we need for the support that we need. And to add on to the idea of this unique experience, you know, AAAS is mostly in Washington, D.C. And so a big part of that is you're there at the center of where a lot of this policy work is happening. And so there's these great broadening opportunities as well to just really expand your perspective into all sorts of different areas that you may not be working even on your fellowship. So I would go down to these policy think tanks and just listen to interesting talks at Brookings or Atlantic Council or any of these places that it's very hard to do without an experience like that, or unless you're living in DC. And that kind of helps help me figure out that I wanted to stay in that world and stay with this bigger picture mentality, because I found it very fulfilling.
So one point I want to make on this is that I think all of us on this panel had the phenomenal opportunity of going through a policy fellowship relatively early career out of grad school. This is not the only way that you can get into science policy. And I want to be really clear about that. There's a tremendous amount of advantages, and we will all talk about the tremendous advantages that came with that. But there are so many different opportunities to think about science policy through NGOs, just going up through an agency and kind of learning the ropes and building kind of that depth of expertise within a particular area or program. There's a huge value for that as well. So I want to just caveat with, these are great opportunities to look into, but not getting into one of these does not close this door of doing science policy. There's lots of other ways to be able to do that. The advantage for these policies is it does accelerate you into conversations, into meetings you might not do as an entry level. I think Stephanie mentioned that earlier, but again, it doesn't preclude this as a pathway if you don't get the fellowship. So.
Right, that's a good clarification. So I had a question from a student in my chat. So it was a question from Kristen. So she's a 5th year in chemistry looking at developing small molecules as antibiotics. So what was the transition like going from doing bench work to working in a government role for each of you? So was there any sort of crash course on government lingo or things like that? Or was it a lot of learning on the job?
I think it's some of both. So for my experience, CCST did a month-long boot camp to talk about how state government worked, how state legislature worked. We got to meet with a number of different department heads to learn about what was happening in different elements of state government to be able to at least help ease the transition. At the time that I did the fellowship, we were only placing in the legislature. And so there was a huge focus about how do you run a bill? How do you go through all the policy committees so that we at least were familiar with terms that were being used, general process, things to look for. But even that will never fully prepare you for jumping into a new position in a different area. And so there was a lot of on-the-job learning, especially in the first couple of months as the first time you're hitting any individual process. And so, you know, I think a lot of it is recognizing it's going to take time. I think this is also true for any job transition, that it takes 6 to 18 months to really fully get comfortable with a new job, right? You want to see the full year cycle. You're learning new skills, you're talking with new people. And so I know for me, a lot of it's just being gentle with myself to know that like I'm not going to be performing at the peak level that I could within the first week, within the first month, within the first 3 months. And so a lot of it is, you know, for me was having conversations with people to learn about what they did, to get feedback on what I was doing, to try to capture as much of that big picture perspective, which you never have in a new position, to be able to help inform the work that I was doing so that I could contribute as best as I could.
Yeah, I think that's all absolutely right. You know, as far as the jump from lab work to policy work, you know, the fellowship helps a lot with that. We had a kind of a boot camp as well. And frankly, I was ready to leave the lab. And so there were no feelings of, you know, missing the lab. I was ready for something new. And really, it is much more akin to any job transition. There is that period of time that is just learning your new organization, what they want you doing, where you can best contribute. And so, yeah, it's really just digging in to understanding the mission that organization has, how they're executing it now, and what you might be able to do as part of their future plans as well, to make an impact.
I know that transitioning from the lab, especially directly into the Department of Defense, and Dennis, I don't know if you experience this, it's sometimes a whole new language. I know a lot of new acronyms, acronyms for everything. And I've learned now working at DoD and CDC that sometimes they mean different things depending on where in the government you work. I sometimes feel lucky that I went straight from the Department of or from CDC to an acquisitions office at the Department of Defense, because it was all much of the work that they did was process and protocol driven. And I liked having that structure to start with. And now work in a much softer space, I'll call it, where it's not as structured, not as structured all the time, which is great for what I'm doing. But I think that what Karen said about giving yourself grace and knowing that with any new job, it's going to be tough. But that just doing what you can to notice things that are new and different from what you've done before, really, that was very helpful to me, to just spend a lot of time listening and observing in that new space. And then eventually you start to feel comfortable jumping in and really taking on some more proactive and leadership roles, but nothing to add from there. Thanks.
One other piece I'll add to this is that what I was not anticipating as a part of the transition was, so I didn't miss the lab work, but there were definitely days I missed the solitude of working in labs. So especially in the first position and now in my current job, my job is I'm in meetings and I talk with people for a living is essentially what I do now. And that it's not just my direct colleagues, it's a lot of external stakeholders, lobbyists, others. And so it's that element of constantly being on is a skill that I have had to develop over the last 10 years of being used to kind of being able to engage with people, talk about those issues, topics shift pretty quickly. So if I have 10 meetings in a day, they're on 8 different topics. And so constantly trying to sort of retool, reset, and get ready for that next discussion. And so those are elements that I do miss about my grad school days, of being able to have one project that I'm working on for a particular day. And then I go and sit and do my plating of cells for the entire day, and I don't have to talk to anybody if I don't want to. I miss those days occasionally. It's the happy introvert in me that misses those. But the trade-offs of what I get to do is that it's sort of more of that wistful, wasn't it great when, and also this is a really awesome and exciting job that I get to do, and I'm really kind of grateful for that transition.
And I think that's sort of a nice transition into the question that Riley posted in the chat about what our work environment is like. So Jennifer's okay if I just jump into that. I think like Karen, there are some things that I miss. Like I miss being able to make a to-do list on Monday night for what I'm going to do on Tuesday, and then actually mark off everything on that list by the time Tuesday evening rolls around. Usually that's how things went for me in graduate school. You said so much. Most weeks I had control over what I was doing each day. And a lot of that's driven by the work you're doing and the protocols you're implementing, things like that. Like I feel like at CDC, they should have like a volunteer program for former laboratorians where we can just go and sit in silence for 2 hours and refill pipette boxes. Like, I feel like I would appreciate that 2 hours of alone time doing a task like that. But so just for the structure of my work environment, that's a really interesting question right now, because since March 17th, I have worked alone at home. I don't know about you, Dennis and Karen, but I am still working remotely. That is shifting some. We are starting to bring people back into our office space at CDC, which is really fantastic. But I am on a permanently remote schedule right now. And for the foreseeable future, I'll only be in the office when it's absolutely necessary to have in-person communication. So it's been a very interesting transition into that hybrid workspace over the last couple of years. And there are positives and negatives. There are things that are working better than they did 2 years ago. And there are things that just are not as easily accomplished when you have people working only virtually or a mix of virtual and in person. I think Karen is exactly right in what she said, is that sometimes your day is all meetings, and oftentimes you haven't scheduled any of those. So someone else has dictated what your entire day will look like, and that's okay. There's a reason, hopefully there's a reason that meeting is on your calendar, and there'll be an outcome or an action that comes at the end of it. So I am almost all day either on a Zoom call or on the phone. I work directly for our division's director, so I have a lot of interaction directly with the leadership of our division, which has been fantastic. And like I said, it's just been a learning curve for all of us to figure out how we can work better together. As for how it's decided for what I work on, my work is probably 90% reactive, 10% proactive. Most things are driven by what deadline is upcoming, what meeting is happening next, and what the policy or funding priority is. I don't just what needs to be done and how can I get it done. The nice thing about the job where I am now, which is a little bit, at CDC, we have our office of the director, and then we have centers underneath that, and then divisions and branches, very standard organization across the government. And being in a division, sort of 3 layers down in that structure, you do have more time to be a little bit more proactive. For example, one of my major projects over the last years, we've put out a large grant opportunity to bring in some new academic and innovation partners. And it's been really exciting to be able to lead those conversations about the innovation portfolio in our division, and what that's going to look like over the next 5-year funding cycle for that grant. But I would say that most of what I do every day is preparing for what's happening tomorrow or in 2 or 3 days. There's not often a lot of time to look out much further than that, just given the specific position that I'm in now.
So a lot of what you're explaining there, Stephanie, it's similar for me. I'm just pulling up the question, so I make sure I hit all of it. The work environment, we've gone back and forth between virtual and in person. We have, at AFRL, we have a lot of lab workers on the government and contractor side. And so a lot of them have more or less been in the lab. Throughout the pandemic, I've been mostly virtual. and then just starting to go back in again after this latest wave. And it really presents a lot of, as she was alluding to, challenges, because you have some people there, some people not. It's not like it used to be where I could just walk down the hall and go find somebody if I needed them. Or hybrid meetings are like the worst of all worlds, where some people are there, some people are not, and the IT inevitably fails behind firewalls and things like that. But overall, you know, I really like where I'm at. We've got a good balance of, you know, a great mission focus, but also I think a great culture that allows all of our skills to and competencies to be expressed. I've had a great experience there. As far as how I interact with supervisors and coworkers, you know, we're set up very much the same way as other agencies. You know, we have commands down to different organizations within the commands, and then divisions, branches, and whatnot. I'm kind of in a unique position where, you know, I have a direct report supervisor, but that supervisor doesn't necessarily dictate what I work on or what I don't work on. You know, throughout my government career, I've worked on a lot of programs that are kind of cross agency, are kind of externally funded by other agencies, and so that's given me a lot more freedom to determine what needs to be worked on and when. You know, I was managing for 5 years a Manufacturing Innovation Institute on behalf of the Office of Secretary of Defense, and so for personnel issues, I had a supervisor, but really, as far as program direction and, you know, accountability for what the funding was doing, I had somebody in Washington, D.C. To report those details to. That's not common, but what is also common where we're at is you know, you'll have the supervisor there that handles the HR type stuff, as well as maybe broad strategy for that organization. But separately, there's a lot of different opportunities to secure funding for the types of work that you want to do. And a lot of what our job is in the government, in the research lab, is to link the latest, you know, state-of-the-art science and technology, develop projects in those areas, and link those to national security needs or warfighter needs to justify funding for that area. So in prior years for me, that was, you know, advancing additive manufacturing so that it can be used for defense needs, and similarly now as well. So that's kind of the core of the job, and it gives me a lot of autonomy to try and set direction with all these checks and balances up to make sure that it's within strategy, that there's funding there, to kind of execute on those needs. So some variant of that is pretty common in the organization I'm in.
So I think this looks very different depending on the positions that I've had. And also want to note that all of us are a little bit later in on careers of doing some of this work. So like in my current position, I oversee about 400 people. So a lot of the work that I'm doing is providing that direction on the work that we do to my teams, talking about prioritization, talking about timing, scheduling, how is this interacting with the mission and direction of the department, and how do we think about trying to both manage core work and then think about those sort of special or new projects that are coming through. A lot of that is pretty collaborative within the teams, but there's also that element of, you know, I'm making final decisions on a lot of things about the work that we do, and then working with my teams to make sure that's implemented. When I first started with the department, I worked as a special advisor to one of our assistant directors. And so I didn't have anybody reporting to me and was helping to manage projects. So a lot of what I was doing was liaising with different groups within the department and elsewhere to really figure out how we would move projects forward. And so a lot of it was more project management and collaboration, and also knowing that I could not dictate what someone did, right? So a lot of it's here's the projects that we have, how do we work together to divvy up tasks and to try to do it as equitably as we can. And again, trying to do that to the best extent collaboratively, and then when necessary, elevating up, say, okay, we need someone else to come in and help direct activity on this if we want to make certain goals, timelines, etc. So some of it's navigating within chains of command, and then some of it's figuring out how do you navigate when you're not reporting to the same person, or when it's two very different organizations that have different priorities and objectives. And so that continues to be true, but the ways in which I interact with that have changed over the course of my career. I think the other element of structure of work environment, at least within my position, is what does it look like to get out into the field? And in some cases, that's literal agricultural fields as a part of work that we do. And sometimes it's that question of how do we get into communities? How are we touring facilities? How are we really seeing so as a regulatory agency, part of our mission is to regulate and allow for certain kinds of businesses to occur. And so there's a lot of inspections that come along with that. There's a lot of, there's a tremendous importance for kind of seeing physically, what does this look like? And when we say we think it's easy for you to put a 500-foot buffer around an agricultural field before you apply this particular pesticide. Okay, well, let's go into the field and see what that looks like. And what does that mean for proximity of houses? What does that mean for proximity of a road? What does that mean for timing to apply? Or practically, how much crop are you going to lose if you do that? As a way to inform the work that we're doing. And that piece of it's been really challenging over the last 2 years because we haven't been going out into the field. And so I think there's or rather, we're still doing enforcement inspections, but we're really limiting some of those other kind of nice to haves rather than need to haves as a part of the department's function. And so I think that continues to be a challenge for how do we put a face to government, and to be able to also put a face to the individuals, the communities, the businesses that we work with to really understand what those impacts are. And so that's I think an evolving way that we're working, and I'm really sort of interested to see how that starts to reopen over the course of the next 3 to 6 months, for how much we get back to business as usual in that ways, and how we're continuing to use technology to allow for different kinds of access to the public.
I think one aspect of science and technology policy that we've touched on a little bit here is, I guess I would call it science diplomacy. And so it's not just something that the State Department does in the technological engagements. And I want to actually start by going back to a question we talked about earlier. It's like, so what can you be doing now in graduate school to build some of these skills? And I think that even the work that you do in collaborating with other labs at UIUC, with other academic institutions, potentially with industry and other non-governmental organizations, in the research that you do, helps you build those science diplomacy skills in the relationship building that you're doing. And I think I really value the experiences that I had. So much of what I did for the first 8 years of my time, both as a fellow and then at CDC, was engaging with CDC or Department of Defense equivalents in other countries around the world. And even if that never turned into a long-term project, the importance of those relationships really drove all that we did day to day in the work that we were doing. It helped to guide funding decisions, policy decisions, and of course, in the background, all of that is driven by national security objectives. And so I think that for me, I spent more time talking with people outside of my organization than I did within, sometimes just because of the importance of that science diplomacy aspect. And we touched on that a little bit here. So I just wanted to take it back to sort of what are some of those skills that you can be building now. And then one thing, it's so valuable to be able to bring both the technical background that you have and sort of the oomph that comes with somebody seeing PhD or MS after your name, especially in international settings when you're trying to have those technical discussions, and then pairing that with the communication skills that Karen referenced earlier as being so important.
So you all kind of alluded to this in this last answer, but there was another question in the chat that came in. Could you describe a typical day on the job? For example, how does your work schedule look like? How much of your day consists of meetings, writing, etc.?
I mean, I think for me, it's similar to Stephanie. There's a lot of meetings for sure, a lot of Zoom calls or other platforms. In my role as a PM, I don't oversee anybody, but I'm kind of the nexus for a lot of different people with different skills and competencies to come together and work on our problem. So there's a lot of coordinating their activities and budgets and figuring out how to get things contracted. And beyond that, I think we touched on it earlier, you really become very adept at being a PowerPoint wizard, because you're always communicating with somebody, whether it's with your team, whether it's up the chain, whether it's at a conference, sharing about what you're doing. And really a lot of effort goes into tailoring what you say to those audiences and how it presents, and making sure that message is directed to the people that you're going to be talking to. So that does take up a lot of our time, as well as outreach and just kind of for us doing tech scouting and understanding what's going on out there. So doing site visits with potential partners we'd want to work with to understand their capabilities, and visiting with them at conferences and all these types of things, just to understand the landscape, is another big part of my day to day.
I mean, I think it really varies. I'm tempted to do a screen share. So I'll talk about calendaring. Let's go start with a nice looking calendar. So this gets to like what your job is and what you're doing. So again, when I was serving as sort of a policy advisor, a lot of my work was more project specific. So I think I had maybe 3 or 4 projects that I was working on that had different timing and tempos for them. So it's a huge range of different projects. It's kind of balancing the needs of a lot of different groups that are coming through and on a huge range of different topics. So a lot of this is that what's coming up to me is teams that have like synthesized ideas, and they're coming to like, this is our plan. This is what we want to move forward with, approval or not approval, or additional discussion is needed on these items, or active working meetings to be able to talk through items. And so the day-to-day was pretty varied even 3 years ago, but the variety and I think the meeting intensity looks different now, because I'm no longer the person who is developing the materials themselves. That's what I was doing 3 years ago. And so having those longer blocks of time to be able to sit down and actually create a document, or work through drafting regulatory text or supporting materials or whatever that looks like, or informal meetings with people, looks very different than it does today.
And I think maybe I was lucky that my calendar craziness peaked during the 2 years I was working for the CDC director, and I may never see a day like that again. But I mean, I have a job now where so much of it's literally in my job description that I am the coordinator of division special projects. And so that cannot be done if I'm not making sure that those things are moving forward. And so just the nature of the work really does drive the calendar. And so I'm glad that it doesn't look like Karen's this week.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. That the nature of your job is an important determinant there. Also, whether you're a supervisor or not, because there come with that a lot of, you're responsible for all these other people. So I'm fortunate at this point that I don't have that responsibility. That might be in the future. And also, specifically to the military, that might be more like what you would see with a staff job. If you're looking at policy and end up in the military, you're likely to end up on some sort of a headquarters staff or other staff that looks like that, and they are always in meetings, pounding the pavement, coordinating with other offices, and I know that their calendars look like that, and they're very difficult to reach. Whereas if you're a program manager or in the lab, you might have more blocks of time potentially.
I should just flag, this is maybe a slightly heavier week because my boss I was on vacation last week. I was on vacation last week. My boss is on vacation next week. So, there's certain things that impact that, and this is ebb and flow. But I think that this is part of career evolution and career selection, is like, those are questions to be asking yourself and to be asking of jobs that you're going through, of what do you want your days to be like? Do you want to be talking with people all day and being in meetings? Okay, not a bad thing, right? There's ways to be able to move in that direction. If you want to be doing science policy, but having those longer blocks of time to sit and think and develop, well, then there's going to be different career decisions that you're making. And that will also look different over the course of your career, that there's seasons where that may make sense for what you want to do. And then seasons that you want to have a different kind of job, different emphasis. And so those things, you have control to some extent over what you're looking at. And if you stumble into a job and it's not the balance of what you want to have, careers are long, careers have the ability to change, and you kind of continue to look and evolve from there.
Yeah, absolutely agree with Karen there. Really thinking about what your values are when going into a job search helps. So any other questions from students? If not, there was another question that was posted earlier. So what kind of factors or qualities do you think got you your job, and what are important things that your employers are looking for? Is it your technical skills, your publications, or soft skills? If you can give us some ideas on that.
I mean, I'll say that where we're at, in a lab, the technical skills are, especially for your entry level, PhD positions, that is important. If you're looking more at the policy track, your publication record and things like that will be a factor, but not the factor. It'll be these other things that we've been talking about, these other skills that you can develop, and how you grow into whatever role they would be directing you to. So it's very dependent on the path that you want to take, what skills we look for. And I think it's usually a safe bet that the things that are hot areas technically are areas that we are looking to hire for, that industry is looking to hire for, and similarly on the policy side, a lot of these different organizations and government and NGOs, they want to develop their policy bench in those areas as well, because they're going to have the big impact going forward.
I think it's similar at CDC as well. I think if you're looking for a technical position, either working on a specific public health condition or a specific disease or in a laboratory, your publication record, subject matter expertise, et cetera, is going to really come to bear, of course, in that position. For jobs, things that we would call a public health analyst, a health scientist, or a policy specialist, it definitely is an emphasis more on those small skills. I think being able to articulate how you can translate your technical skills in support of the work of the office where you are considering employment is really important. And being able to give specific examples of those soft skills, communication, team building, teamwork, coordination, and collaboration. I think that those are really important. I know, just thinking of my personal experience, as you work longer, you have more of those examples that you're able to provide. So don't feel like you need to have them all now, but it is good to think 5-10 years down the road. What do you want to say that you have accomplished or that you have done? And then seek out opportunities, whether it's in the job you have now or the position you move to next, that you can build those. I know that's one of the reasons I took the position I have now, is because I'd worked 8 years in global health, I had no idea how CDC's domestic public health programs work. How do we fund our partners? How do we operate at the state level, et cetera? And so I wanted to get more on the ground, in this case, on the Zoom programmatic experience of what those domestic programs look like. And that was a real motivation for taking this job. I may not be passionate about the subject matter every day, but I am building a skill set that is transferable. So think down the road, several years, but also think about how your next position can help you build those skills you need and make an actual list. I did that. I made a list of the things that I needed to learn how to do to get where I wanted to be within this agency. And it's been nice to actually check some of those off. Some of them I never want to do again. Did them once, can say I did it, and moving on.
Awesome. Thank you all for sharing those. So if there isn't any other questions from our participants, I think we can end our session a little early, but any final thoughts for our students, postdocs who are here, from each of you who are starting off in their careers, thinking about science and technology policy, or any advice for the long term from you all?
I'll just say happy to be a resource for any of you as you're thinking about careers in this area. Happy to have, one-on-one conversations, emails about this sort of thing. It's, I love where I've wound up. It was not where I was necessarily planning to go when I got into grad school or even halfway through. And I think that I've heard this in various themes over the course of this time, but that careers are long, careers are not necessarily linear. And, I can go back and I can give you a really nice sounding description of what my career has done, but it's really, sometimes it's something shows up and you take a chance on a new position or a new opportunity or a new area. And it, maybe it's something you do once, you never want to do again, or it changes entirely the course of what you want to be working on. So I think there's, you build the skills that you're working on that we've talked about over the course of this call, and then it's finding and taking advantage of some of the opportunities that may come your way.
I think, looking back, the biggest thing, definitely want to develop the wide set of skills beyond the lab. I think we've talked a bit about that, but it's probably being proactive if this is a path that you want to take, because it's not, typically grad school is not geared to train you specifically for this. So if it's where you want to go, it's going to take very deliberate steps to develop those skills and to make the connections that you need to, go directly into it, or to build your portfolio or set of skills to qualify for one of these fellowships and to win it. So just be very deliberate, and if it's what you want, aggressive in those steps to develop those skills, because it's just not as straightforward of a path always. So and definitely be willing to take an opportunity and take a plunge. If it takes you halfway across the country, that might be what it takes, but it can be very, very fulfilling and enlightening, and I'd highly recommend it.
I'll just say ditto. Happy to be a resource and just be open to what comes along. And if there's a particular area of science policy that you're interested in, the three of us may not be the best person to talk to, but I'm betting we probably know someone, or know someone who knows someone who is. So just don't be afraid to ask for a connection to be made. And I know that I've never had someone tell me no, they wouldn't do that for me. And I think that most people are going to be willing to share those connections and experiences.
Yes, absolutely. Our alumni are all amazing. They, if anyone is passionate about what they do, they like talking about it and sharing about it with other students, and which is why you're here right now. So thank you all. That's it from my questions, and I suppose there's no other questions from the audience as well. But thank you all so much for volunteering your time and coming in to talk to our students and sharing your expertise and knowledge with us. The recording of this session will be posted on the Illinois media space, so look out for an email from me. But with that, thanks again for joining us, and I hope you have a good rest of your day.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks
Take
so
care.
much. Have a good weekend.
You too.